My name is Jennifer Smith, and I'm a management consultant. I've been a CMC certified consultant since 2008. So you are joining day two on balanced performance measurement, session two, metrics versus strategy. So I see a number of people coming in who were with us yesterday. So looking forward to moving the conversation forward. I'm going to begin, I think, because we're at 12:01, and there's a number of people that have now joined us. I'd like to, before we begin, I realized I was remiss in doing this yesterday, but acknowledging that I live and work and enjoy life on the unceded traditional territory of the Algonquin, Anishinaabe Nation and people. I'm always thankful every day for the great city I live in, and I recommend everyone, because I know everyone's coming from different places in Canada, take the time to do a similar acknowledgement for the region that you live in. Dwight Michalicz. He is president and founder of Effective Managers, Inc. He's a certified management consultant, and he is a past chair of the International Council of Management Consultants Institute, as well as a fellow with the Business Excellence Institute. So he is a recognized expert in the area of performance management and helping leaders shift and find new ways of measuring results. So we had an interesting conversation yesterday that builds to today of looking at metrics versus strategy. So I'll pass it over to you, Dwight.
Well, thank you very much, Jennifer. I really appreciate that, and welcome back. I see many faces that we saw yesterday, so thank you for returning. And I see some new faces as well. So welcome to this series. Yesterday we did dig a little bit into some of the issues in organizations that get in the way of success. And then at the end, I presented you a model. So today I'm just going to remind you of the model quickly, and particularly for those who are new, but not in as much detail. The full explanation, of course, is available on our YouTube channel under session number 1. I've then got a couple of case studies, and then what I would like to do is do a bit of a dive into each one of the different aspects of the model. And again, we have 1 hour today, so it'll be a bit of a taste of what I intend by each one of those different components in the model. We've done, I could do an hour or an hour and a half on each one of them. In fact, I've done a master class for CMC Canada where we've explored these in much more detail. So the starting point is the model, and what we did at Effective Managers is really try to find something that was more organic and that could answer the question about why some organizations are successful and why others are not. And in the same way that some trees can thrive in the same area where some trees don't thrive in the other areas. So I proposed to you a model which had 3 different components to them. The first component were the structural elements, and all of those structural elements had to do with organization design, strategy, and business model. And as I say, I'll be talking about each one of those independently as we move on. The second component is around the outcomes. So the outcomes of the organization have to do with things like the culture, how we do things here, the performance of our organization, and then finally the profit of the organization, which is the ultimate outcome measure. And then the trunk of the tree, which holds everything together, connects the business model and strategy together with the outcomes, is the trunk of the tree. And that trunk of the tree also has 3 components, which are accountability and authority, managerial leadership, and managerial capability or fit to role. Getting the right person into the right seat. Those are the people or the input side of the equation. So how do we measure how we're doing our work in addition to what the outcomes are or what we're developing and delivering in terms of our work? So to start off, yesterday it was a bit kind of research-based. I showed you 3 different research studies, which gave you insights into what's happening inside organizations. Today, I wanted to give you a bit more impact in a kind of personal way in terms of case studies. So the first one, I'd ask if anybody knows who this gentleman is, John Stumpf. You may remember him from 2016 when he was at the Warren Commission. He was the CEO of Wells Fargo. That picture was taken at the Senate inquiry, which the government of the United States held to investigate the goings-on at Wells Fargo over the last several years in terms of its compliance with regulatory matters. And what had been happening over the last several years is that front-end workers, the financial services people in the organization, were fraudulently selling products. So they would talk to someone and then either talk them into taking a product they didn't need, or without the knowledge of the person that they were making the sale to, they would sign them up, for example, to a credit card, because they had all the personal information. And after the call, the person received a credit card in the mail that they didn't expect to have or feel that they actually needed. So in September of that year, September of 2016, the bank actually agreed after that Senate hearing to a $185 million settlement with regulators and a city official acknowledging the wrongdoing of opening approximately 2.1 million accounts, which were fictitious or were unauthorized. So it poses the question, the one that we would ask is what was the strategic goal of Wells Fargo in over this period of about 4 years before 2016? You can be sure that the strategy didn't say we should sell over 2 million fraudulent products to unsuspecting customers. No, that would never be an output measure. But the strategy was absolutely around how do we increase sales and how do we drive profit inside this organization. So it's a perfect example of output measures driving activity inside the organization, which just simply isn't appropriate by any measure. Once the CEO and the head of the organization, the heads of the different divisions realized what was going on, they started taking all kinds of activity to try to turn this around, including firing over 5,000 staff from in the organization in that 3-year period. The CEO at the Senate hearing said he had no intentions of resigning, but within a month he did resign, and in fact lost some $40 million of stock options that he would have otherwise had. So it is an example of unintended consequences of that focus on the output measures. And Wells Fargo is a stark example, but even here in Canada, CBC, our national news channel, did a serious investigation and followed up with employees in Canadian banks. And lo and behold, they found that similar types of practices were in place throughout the organization. Once they opened and made public the investigation, they received over 1,000 emails from financial services officers in all of the major banks in Canada saying that we feel forced to be doing these exact types of things. Now, again, it's not managers saying, sell a fraudulent product or open up an unauthorized account. It's that focus on the output metric of the sales and the profit that drives unintended consequences inside the organization. So enough about banking. I'd like to move on to a different case, which is on the positive side of things. This is George Weber. He was the president and CEO of the Royal Hospital in Ottawa. I had the pleasure of actually working for him. He used to be the head of the International Red Cross based in Geneva, and I worked with him on a global project where I first became involved in organization design, reorganizing the operations of the Red Cross in 86 different parts of the world. So in any event, I knew him for a long time. And when he came back to Canada, he got involved in different organizations. And since I was a consultant of the day, repeats and referrals, I was able to do consulting work with him. So he was appointed as the CEO of the Royal Hospital. He's now retired, or as George would say, he's rewired. He's into all kinds of other things, but no longer the CEO. But he came in a particularly difficult time. Canadian hospitals are complex organizations to begin with, but the healthcare budgets in Canada are growing at such an incredible rate that the provinces who are in charge of healthcare funding are cutting back on resources. So their intent to save money on budgetary expenses is to hold the line. So often budgets were held at 0%. Sometimes there'd be even a slight decrease in budgets, -1 or -2%. Which, when you think about the fact that there's such a high proportion of unionized labor who have steady increases that are coming in, realizes that for operational costs, you're really having to cut back in order to be able to meet it. But in spite of those things, the employees and the staff at all levels inside the organization were really driven to provide excellent client results. So there's no question that people were doing their very best. They were just doing it under difficult circumstances, and the hospital itself was in pretty poor shape, if I might say, as a consultant when he took over. So what did George do as the CEO? He developed a strategic plan. There had been plans in place, but they were one of these, as I mentioned yesterday, one of the sponge strategies that were trying to be all things to all people. So he used the plan as the tool to develop a focus in terms of what work we needed to do. He designed performance indicators that went along with the strategic plan. And as I say, when I say he, I mean he and his team, his executive team did this work collaboratively. They then established targets and measured those targets against the performance indicators to see how well they were doing against the plan. And they assessed and implemented organization design improvements. So this is one of the structural issues that I was mentioning before. So the business model was pretty straightforward for a hospital. The strategic plan put in place, and then the organization design improvements to make sure that the staff are appropriately aligned to do the work that needed to be done. And then came, cheers on my side, the input measures, assessed engagement annually for the employees, and then implemented with consulting help. Yes, George was a client of mine at this period, implemented managerial leadership initiatives, including the effective point of accountability. So who's accountable for what, when? And most importantly, in all of these things, the results were measured and they were tracked, and there were consequences for those measures. And from my perspective, in terms of input measures, the four that were tracked, with which I'll be talking to you about somewhat today, is the manager effectiveness. So how well are managers doing their job? Employee engagement. So how empowered and engaged are employees in the organization? The client or patient outcomes. So how well are we doing in terms of what we need to do for patients? And then the overall organizational outcomes. What do we need to do in terms of the strategy for the organization? And the results speak for themselves. So actually, I got really excited when I was working inside the organization. I realized that they had longitudinal data on all of these measures. So I asked if it would be possible to do a research study to look at the input measures and the output measures and do correlations on those. And George, being progressive in many ways, agreed that we would do that. So I worked with Dr. Prince, who was the head of their strategy department, and we did the analysis and then put together a report, which was published at the which was published in a medical journal. So the results are those as we have published them. So in terms of manager effectiveness, by getting all of the things in place in terms of organization design and accountability, increased from 59% to 68%. Employee engagement and the degree to which employees are engaged in their work increased from 67 to 73%, I think. Yes, 73%. Sorry, my screen's a little small here. Client experience, in other words, are we doing with clients what we say we will do and what we must do? This didn't increase as much because it was already high. Remember, I mentioned that all the staff were dedicated to the client experience. So that went from 82% to 86%, still an increase. And then finally, the overall organizational objectives, which are about how we do work in the organization, are from 64% to 81%. So these are amalgamated scores just to give you an insight of what was happening. If anyone's interested in that journal article, drop me an email. I'd be happy to share it with you if you want to have a look at it. So the key point here, though, that I'm trying to make is that it's necessary to have this balanced approach to what are the outcomes that we're looking for and what are the inputs. How is it that we're going to do about in terms how is it we are going to go about doing our work so that we can achieve those outcomes. And if we lose sight of the input side of the equation, how we do our work, you can have the kinds of unintended consequences that our banks went through and that are absolutely not necessary for success in organizations.
Dwight, can I just ask you, can I bump in and ask a question?
You sure can.
Okay, Tracy has asked this and it stuck in my mind as well. And I think Marvin also indicated, just curious, how do you measure manager effectiveness?
I've got an actual slide on that. So we've actually developed an instrument to do that because it doesn't exist outside of that. So we're working on that right now. So I'll come back to that. And Tracy, if I don't give you enough information, then jump in again.
And do you want to just explain what you see as the difference between KPIs and performance measures?
I also coming to that.
Okay.
Very good. I'll have to hire Tracy for the segues.
Perfect.
Perfect. Thank you very much. So I'll come to all of those because I think they're excellent questions. And then if I'm not complete enough, we can go into those. Yesterday, I walked you through this in terms of engagement scores where Gallup in millions of responses compared the top quartile of organizations with engagement scores, top quartile of engagement scores, with the bottom quartile of engagement scores with organizations around the world. And while there are differences from economy to economy and culture to culture, on average, globally, these are the kinds of results that you can see. So I was asked for some links yesterday. So Sandra was kind enough to say that if anyone would like to get more information about engagement, I have a white paper, so she'll put in the chat box a link to download that white paper if you're interested in terms of I call it empowerment. I think that's the next level after engagement, but there are a lot of factors involved, and you can dig in a bit deeper there if you'd like to do that. So the model then does have the factors that we talked about. So I'll just quickly now in the next few slides talk about those areas and go through each one of them in just a bit more detail, just to give you a taste of what's happening. So the business model, fundamentally, I like to keep it really, really simple with working with client organizations. It really is what do we do and who is our target market. So what are our products or services, and who is our target market, and how do we go about putting that in place. So I don't think I need to say too much more about that, but it is the most fundamental part of any organization's business, is understanding what we do and who we do it for or with. I talk about private sector in all of my language, and this is private sector, but it absolutely applies to government and not-for-profit as well. So the what is sometimes not purchased by the who. It could be given as a service by a not-for-profit organization or by a government, but the outcome measures and the income measures apply in equal ways. It's just that we need to have different types of measures to keep track of them. When it comes to strategy, I shared this slide yesterday, so I won't get into it in a lot of detail, only to say that most organizations are pretty good at figuring out that Pegasus that they want to become over the next 3, 5, or 10 years or whatever it might be. But most organizations actually end up with a result that doesn't look at all like their intention. And in fact, 70% of organizations fail to achieve their strategic goals. I was asked yesterday about the research that Dr. Cotter had done, and it was across all sizes of organizations. So people were asking if there were differences between large and small organizations. So while the percentages differ, organizations in general are not good at implementing strategy. And the key point I make on this one, and I talked about it yesterday, is that strategy development is one thing, but strategy execution is another. Way too often organizations spend way too much time and complexity in developing the strategy and not enough time on the strategy execution side. So we end up with situations, and this is the typical situation I see when I go inside organizations. It's the situation that I experienced when I worked inside organizations as a manager, executive, or the head of the organization. Is you have a number of different projects that are trying to take you from your current state, where we are now, to get to that desired future state. So I should have put a little picture of the Pegasus up there, because we want to be the Pegasus in that top right-hand corner. So you put that project in place. And as the projects are all put in place, the individuals that are running those projects are working through the filters from their perception of what needs to happen in their part of the organization to get there. So what happens over time is that it's kind of like vectors, the projects are pulling in the organization in different kinds of directions based on what the outcomes are expected for each one of those different projects. And as a result, your ability to take that straight line path to the desired future state is just not possible. So what's necessary is to have that very directive accountability and authority framework to ensure that people are working on the right things at the right time, so that our structure looks, our project structure looks more like this, that we're all working together to support each other and do our own work within our own departments or teams, but they're all working within the grand design of the strategy and pulling that together. That requires managerial leadership, and it requires coordination from the top of the organization, and each one of them doing their managerial leadership work as we move ahead. So the third structural element is organization design. And I was a specialist in organization design. That was all I did as a consultant for 10 years in my consulting career. And we found that in general, organizations are not very well designed because they grow organically. And there's not a clear understanding of the complexity of work and how it varies or should vary from role to role and level to level in the organization. And there's not a lot of understanding about human capability in terms of how people should be assigned into roles for complexity of work. So the organization design really does need to take place in the organization from a basis of what are the right number of layers for this organization and what it's trying to do now, and how do we align these functions inside the organization for what it is that we need to do now. And I was introduced, gosh, a little over a couple of decades now, sorry to say, to scientific principles of organization design. And they do exist. The power of science is that we are able to replicate things in a consistent way over time. If you think about Newton, he's my favorite example for this, because apples were falling off of trees ever since apple trees existed. But it wasn't until Newton came along that he actually started asking the question, why do apples fall from trees? Why do they fall in that direction? And he was able to describe describe the theory of gravity, and then from his descriptions, you were able to apply that to different in different applications in different ways, which provided us which provided science with a huge step forward. So exactly the same thing does exist in organization design. There are scientific principles in terms of complexity of work, and it has to do with how long someone is accountable for carrying out tasks moving forward. And it also has to do with human capability. What is the ability of people to be able to do this work over that period of time? So just for a quick example, if you're a frontline worker and you come into the organization, you're responsible for following a procedure to do work on a day-to-day basis. So come in, do your work, go home. It's a very straightforward work. If you're a vice president of an organization and you're accountable for opening a new market in a different part of the world, that might be a 5-year deliverable. So you're accountable for doing this over 5 years, and you have all of these other things that you need to do to keep in play to manage that complexity of accomplishing this task over that period of time. So we would know that we can't, for example, promote someone from a frontline worker to a vice president, but exactly those same differences occur at every level of complexity of work in the organization. This is the second white paper that I promised you for, promised Sandra for today. So if you're interested in a bit more about that, you can click on the link in the chat and download that. So moving over to the output side of the equation. So what are our outputs? The first one we have is culture. And in that one, I did mention yesterday, and I see in some of the gallery here, some people did raise their eyebrows a little bit, that culture is an outcome measure. Typically, we think in organizations, or there's general thought inside organizations that culture is a way of achieving outcomes. But I really do believe that culture is a measure of what's happening inside the organization. So culture is a combination of the values of the organization. You know, what do we value here, and what are the actions that we take inside the organization in order to carry out our work. So it's that demonstrated behavior inside the organization by all of the managers, executives, and employees in the organization that in its totality becomes the culture of that organization. And certainly culture can be changed over time. Cultures can be negative, or they can be very, very positive. And we do see from research studies that if you can have a positive culture, that can help you to drive towards success. So it becomes a really important measure. And I think that by thinking of it as one of the outcome measures, a means to the end, it becomes very, very, very helpful. The next one is performance. So the second of the outcome measures is performance. And this is where most organizations spend most of their time thinking about what do we measure and how do we do it. So we have our scorecard, we have our different kinds of outcome measures, whatever they might be, and use that as their mirror in terms of what we're doing. And I use the word mirror literally because when you're using outcome measures, whether they're KPIs or whatever else you call them, they are measuring what has already happened. So of course, that's a good indicator to where we will be going in the future, but they are not very helpful in terms of figuring out how well we're doing the work. It only gives you the insights into what we have accomplished, and not so much into how well we accomplished or how well we're doing on other areas. So in performance, I did mention in passing, and I thought I'd show you a slide of it today, is the value-added plan. I'm sharing this with you. There's nothing proprietary about this. It's really straightforward. In anywhere you can read about mission, vision, values. What's different about it is that my suggestion to client organizations is that each manager of a team, wherever they are in the organization, should have a plan that covers off these dimensions. So the head of the organization has the strategic plan. So that covers off the goals that are organization-wide, the mission, the vision, the values of the organization. So the head of the organization is well served, and there's been a lot of time spent thinking about that. But if you're the head of finance, or you're the head of operations, or you're the head of sales, what is your mission? What is your day-to-day job in terms of delivering what is necessary for success in the organization? What's your vision for your department? What do you want to look like in the next 2 or 3 years? What are the key goals or key objectives that you have to meet, and how do we measure those in terms of bringing this together? And to respond a little further to a question I had yesterday, it's in that section on the key goals, where you marry together those things that you need to deliver on a day-to-day basis and those change objectives that you have. So, for example, sales is increasing sales by 10% is a strategic goal. Then what are the things that you need to do in your department over the coming months in order to contribute towards that 10% growth in the coming years? And then you get measured on that. At the next level down, you would have a simpler, but still the same kind of a plan for each one of your directors and your managers. So in terms of the objectives, and this is coming back to the question we had from Tracy, I think there's 3 really important components to that. The first one is just the statement of the objective. Where would I like to go? So what is it that I need to do in the organization, or what is it that I need to do in the department? What do I need to do in the business unit? Or if I'm a frontline manager, what do my team and I need to do? What are the objectives that we have? These are not done independently. They're done, of course, in discussion with your own manager. They need to be a subset of your manager's plan, who's a subset of their manager's plan, which are all a subset of the strategy, so that they all link together. This is the tool that we have for making sure that all of those gears are appropriately aligned throughout the organization. The second part is for each one of those objectives, what are the measurable aspects of it? So what is the quality of the work that I need to do? What is the quantity of the work I need to do? And within what time frame do I need to do this work? So that answers the question, how will I know when I've gotten to where I want to get? So this, I thank you to Elliot Jacks, who in his book Requisite Organization introduced the concept of QQT over R. So it's quality, quantity, timeliness, and then what are the resources that I will need to have in order to be able to do this work successfully and to get there. And then finally, initiatives. What are those specific things that I need to do to be able to achieve these objectives over time? So Tracy, does that answer your question? Throw in something else if you wanted a bit more. Oh, I know there was the other point you'd asked is what is the difference, I think, between KPIs and other types of measures?
Yeah, that was someone else, but yeah.
That was someone else. Okay, thank you. So KPIs are a very commonly used terms, and they're often used to mean, I find clients who use them in the sense of what I've just described here, but they're not really sufficient because the KPI is that measure of activity, and they don't create that ability to really define in concrete terms what it is that I need to do differently going forward. So it's a good measure. KPIs are great. I'm not talking against KPIs at all, but when I talk about objectives, it's more about the direction of how you will do your work in order to achieve the results you want to see in the KPIs. So the third of the outcome measures is profit, and profit is a result of doing everything else right. So the profit comes. I picked this image because it's a very, I think it's a nice example. The coins represent the profit, but the trees coming out of it, the sprouts coming out of it indicate the greenness of it. So the doing things in the right way. Is an interesting study. Oh gosh, I'm blanking on who exactly said it, but or who found the study. But employees who believe their company has a higher purpose than just profit are 27% more likely to stay at their companies. So employees do have this sense, if it's all about the dollar, then that's not sufficient to really motivate employees. It really is about what is that higher purpose? Why do we exist as a company? To add value to our communities and to our country or to the world in whatever the market we're working in, and that will motivate them more than simply we're here to make a better profit next year. So that's the outcome measures. I'd like to, and we'll be spending a bit more time, and I think our time is going well, on the three input measures or the people side of the equation. So I showed you this slide yesterday, managerial leadership, and I made the point that managers are those links from the head of the organization to the front line, and that the CEO also must be a manager, and the frontline people must also be managers, because this combination of managing the processes and the people and the leadership, inspiring your team, has to come together in any one individual who is accountable for a team. And today what I wanted to do is dive just a little bit deeper into this one, because there is a main driver for performance. I did research with the University of Ottawa at the Telfer School of Management into understanding managerial leadership and what the performance indicators were. And the main question there was, what is the main driver of performance? And the research came back very, very clearly with one word, and that one word is accountability. So having an accountability and authority framework inside the organization is really important. So you'll recognize accountability and authority is the first one of the three pillars that I have in the input side of the equation, or the people side of the equation. And what we found in the research is that accountability was highly correlated with manager effectiveness. So in organizations that had higher levels of accountability, they had better manager effectiveness, and the correlation was 0.67. So that's in social sciences work, that's very high. A correlation of 1 means something's perfectly correlated. A correlation of 0 means there's no correlation, it's random. So 0.67 means it's a very high, very close correlation. And then in the second step of the equation, the manager effectiveness is highly correlated with organization performance, 0.26. Now, it's not as high as 0.67, but 0.26. If you think about all of the other things that can impact on organization performance, if you can improve the effectiveness of your managers, you can have a significant impact on your overall organization performance. And the support to that we had from Gallup yesterday is that if your managers are more effective, that will increase your employee engagement, and it's those engaged employees that are driving performance with the numbers that we saw. So if it's that simple, why don't more organizations just have better accountability? Well, this is probably the key takeaway that I have for you today, is that as we were doing the factor analysis on accountability, we found that accountability kind of had 2 different dimensions to it. Not kind of, it actually did. So in terms of one factor, we described it as felt accountability. So these were all where managers answered questions about how strongly I feel accountable for doing good work. And managers scored themselves very highly there. They feel accountability for doing good work. And that just fits my picture of most organizations, and I think yours as well. When you see people inside the organizations, they want to be successful, they want their teams to be successful, they want the organization to be successful. So people feel very strongly about that. The second dimension, however, is clarity of accountability. So how clearly do people understand that for which they are accountable? And here you see the score is 6.9 out of 10 on a Likert scale. So it's almost 2 full points lower than the felt accountability. So managers inside the organizations don't feel that they're clearly delegated those things for which they are going to be held to account. It again comes back to the picture I showed you yesterday about being pulled in all of these different directions. If you're not clear about what you're going to be held to account for in terms of your deliverables, excuse me, you are going to be pulled in a lot of different directions. So how do we help to clarify this? So the question inside organizations isn't whether or not people will feel accountable. They'll feel accountable. They're going to want to do good work. The question is, will they feel accountable for doing the right things? And that's managerial work inside the organization in terms of clearly delegating work to the organization. So that was the top of the bark of the trunk of the tree. I'll now like to move on to fit to role. So fit to role, or managerial capability, is all about ensuring that you have the right person with the right skills and knowledge that will be able to apply themselves, and most importantly, has the right problem-solving capability to work at that level of complexity. So as you go higher in the organization, people have to deal with more and more complex problems. So many organizations don't do a very good job of that. There's even a book written about it. It's called The Peter Principle. And the Peter Principle is that people will be promoted to their level of incompetence, because people keep getting promoted. They're doing good here. They get promoted. Oh, not doing so well. They don't get promoted anymore, but they're still at that level of work inside the organization. So there's 2 things that organizations need to have in place for this to work well. The first thing is that they need to really have a really clear understanding of the roles inside the organization. So what is the complexity of work of that role? Is it proceduralized work, level 1 work? Is it, does it require the diagnostic capability that a manager or an individual contributor to bring, which was level 2? Or is it require more complex work, which can be described as you go up higher in the organization? And therefore, what is the problem solving capability that individuals to be successful in that role need to have? And then skills and knowledge. What are the skills and knowledge you need for success in the role? And application. What are the kinds of personal characteristics and social processing skills that you need to be successful in that role? So really, it's a section of the job description. So these are the tasks for this role, and these are the descriptors of what's necessary for success in the role. Then if you have that, when it's time to interview candidates for roles, or when it's time to promote someone, you can compare the candidate's capabilities on problem solving capabilities, skills and knowledge and application. And it's that overlap in the center, which is the fit to role. So this does require a talent pool process inside the organization where they can have the proper description of the roles in a properly organizationally stratified organization, and then it really increases the opportunity for success in the organization. So this comes back to the other question about input metrics, and I think that was Tracy's question, perhaps. So there is a problem on the input metrics, and this was something that really came out of the research that we did with the University of Ottawa, is to understand what is happening inside organizations. So the first one is, are managers doing their managerial leadership work? And this becomes really important to understand. One of the predictors of that is employee engagement. So any of you that have seen engagement scores in the organization, usually most managers are kind of in the middle, and there'll be one or two bright spots where their teams have really high engagement scores, and there'll be a few really dark spots where the managers don't have, the teams of those managers do not have very good engagement scores. But it's better to measure directly what are their managerial leadership skills. I'll show you an example on the next slide. And then there's the manager effectiveness. These are the organization-wide systems that are in place about whether or not managers are being affected. So what is the felt accountability of managers? What's the clarity of accountability of managers? Is there role conflict? In other words, people don't collaborate well across the organization. Are there silos in terms of workflow, and work doesn't flow well across the organization? So these can give you insights into what some of the root causes are of managers perhaps not doing their managerial leadership as well as they can. It's also helpful to measure employee engagement. This is even SurveyMonkey has a template for employee engagement, so those are very commonly available. Gallup has their 12 questions. It's really 13, but they call it the Q12, where they measure employee engagement. But it is possible to measure that, and should be measured regularly inside the organization. And then finally, the support services. How well are support services actually providing services inside the organization versus supporting kind of the upward kinds of services in the organization? That can give you some really good insights as well. So to support that, we have developed a portal based on surveys where we can measure those things, and then provide interactive ways of organizations understanding where their team members are in terms of each one of those different dimensions. So this one is for managerial leadership. So for each manager, you can get a pretty clear insight just at a glance as to whether they're doing their managerial leadership or not, based on the feedback that they will be getting from their team members. So I find this very useful for client organization staff. Go ahead, Jennifer.
Yes, I was just going to ask, can you give a couple of examples of what the measures are? It's just hard to read. It might be helpful for people to see what some of just a random sampling of what you have there.
Okay, so in terms of, excuse the side of my head because I have to read it on the big screen here, but in terms of managerial leadership roles, and you should be able to read this on the PDF. If you don't, let me know and I can fix that for you. So I understand how my work contributes to the goals of our unit and the manager. So is the manager doing a good enough job of really helping them understand where they fit into the overall organization? My manager provides timely feedback on the work that I do. So am I getting feedback in a regular way, and is it helpful? Here's the one that scores the lowest almost all the time. My manager spends too much time reviewing my work and double checking my decisions. So micromanaging, in other words. So are they micromanaging or giving the appropriate amount? And the difference between the two is that one just gives the rank score out of 10 on a Likert scale, and the other one tells how many people were strongly disagreed or to strongly agreed. So you can get a sense of, is it just a few people feel very strongly that I'm not doing the work, or is there an overall balance that I'm not doing well with any of my team members? Confidential, of course. I do believe that confidentiality is important. So I'm not promoting this as a tool specifically. Don't want to do that to you, but thinking about these things and figuring out how to help clients get this information, or if you're an executive in a non-consulting organization on this call, how do you gather this information in ways that can be helpful to you in terms of coaching your team members to do better on the managerial leadership side? So that brings me to the end of the formal comments I had. I loved the question and answer session yesterday. We got into a lot of really good information, so I'd be very happy to do that again. And I do, again, send out the invitation that I will respond to questions and appreciate any insights that you have. From yesterday, I appreciated some of the all of the LinkedIn invitations that I had, and some new followers on my YouTube channel. So if you'd like to get more information about this, I have a lot of information on YouTube where you can dig deeper. I did mention about the master classes with CMC Canada, and also do feel free to be in touch with me, either to subscribe to my newsletter or to connect with me on LinkedIn or Facebook. Very much appreciate it. You will be getting a PDF of these slides right after this session, and you'll be able to get the information there. So let's open it up now then, Jennifer, to comments and questions.
Yeah, I'm going to go back to one Brenda had earlier, and the slide on the business model. Sorry, my dog was barking. Apologies.
No problem.
When you define so it's going back to when you define your clients' what and who. Do you actually survey any of the customers to see if this lines up with what they're actually purchasing from your clients?
Yeah, this is a very important point. So yes, I'm saying that at the most fundamental level, the business model is pretty simple, but then the actual enactment of it and the modification of it has a lot of complexity to it. So I don't do that work personally, but I think it is a very important piece of work that needs to be done. So customer knowledge, understanding what the customer vision or customer receptivity is to your organization is really important. So I don't want to undermine any of that other additional work that needs to be done to ensure that you're on the right track as a company.
Okay, thanks. Arnab had a question, just very thought-provoking, and just mentioned in regards to the manager's performance assessment, just curious to know your views about continuous monitoring of performance by supervisors with honest feedback instead of the quarterly and half-year evaluation process.
Yes, yes, and yes. So from my perspective, performance appraisals, that annual thing, should be banned in organizations. It does no good, and it does lots of harm. So really managers do need to do their job on an ongoing, continuous basis. You have to catch people doing right and reward for them in the moment. And if something's not going so well, you have to coach them immediately as well, just to help them through that rough patch that they're having. Now, you do need something formal in the organization to document this. So I do recommend to clients at least a monthly meeting, which is kind of the formal touch bases meeting between, say, a director and managers. But at the front line, it has to be daily, a daily kind of a touchback.
Okay, perfect. Stephen had a question, and I don't know how familiar you are with logic models. They are something I'm quite familiar with in government, but in terms of logic models, in terms of performance measurements, how you find those, whether you use them at all in your practice?
No, I don't. I don't work in the public sector at all, so I can't even say that I'm familiar with that. So Jennifer, you might want to explain it a bit for some of the private sector people here.
Transcended, has it? Well, logic models, I think, came out of more out of evaluation practice, but I really see it as a planning, measuring, and reporting tools. But it's a one-page overview of what you're trying to achieve. So if it's an organization setting out, what are the resources? So not all do, but link in the resources you're required to do the job. What are the key activities? What are the outputs? And then what are the ultimate outcomes that you're trying to achieve along the way? So I find it a very good communications tool because it's just all on one page. But yeah, much more common in government.
Okay, well, and so all that sounds really good to me. And in fact, the value added plan is not so much about the piece of paper you have at the end. It's those conversations that the employee and the manager, the team manager are having in an ongoing way. So anything that improves that communication and the two-way feedback between the manager and the team member is really, really important.
Yeah, that's perfect. Yeah, and often I find they're done like ex post when they're really supposed to be part of the overall planning and visioning of things coming out. Tracy had a comment back. She just talked about, and I'm the same, I'm reading from another side, that organizations are good at making the plans, but less successful at tracking and measuring them in terms of making course corrections. So just some thoughts on that in terms of the ongoing tracking.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. As most organizations spend a lot of time and effort. I'll go into client organization, and I work with the CEO, and the CEO's pressing problem is that he needs a strategy. And yet once I'm inside the organization, I'll see that he's got one from a year ago, one from 2 years ago, one from 3 years ago. They're all relatively the same. And so I ask about them, and the CEO will say, well, we tried those and they didn't work, so we want to do it again. So the focus really has to shift from developing that strategy. Let's pick any one of those, but let's figure out how do we chunk it up and break it down and delegate it to each one of your immediate team members in terms of what they need to do so that you can be successful over time. So what you're saying is exactly right. The work starts once the strategy is approved, because that's when all the hard work really begins to make sure that everybody is working differently and working in concert with where you want to take the organization over the coming time period.
Perfect. I'm going to have one other question I'm going to bring in, but someone had also asked for a copy of the manager's value added plan. I just mentioned they were in the deck. I didn't know they were shared in advance. I thought they were being shared after, but I don't know if she was interested in more of the plan, but just mentioning that they are there.
Okay, yeah, it is in the deck. And if anybody wants like a Word copy, I'm happy to share that. Just send me an email and I'll reply to you with it.
So here's an interesting one from Milos. Can this overhead of continuously engaging with your team to give them constructive feedback be somehow optimized as to not be overtaxing to you, your other daily work? It is an investment for sure.
That's yeah, and we talked about this a little bit yesterday, but that is the challenge of managing. I remember the first time I ever got a managerial role, I was so upset that I didn't have time to do my real work because I was in meetings all the time, until I realized my real work was to be in the meetings with my team members. But you have to find the balance, and that is one of the challenges as a manager is to find that balance between having engaging, robust ongoing communications with your team members, but not at the expense of you needing to do what your own value added work is, which is separate from which is in addition to the managing that you do. So it's one of the skills of managing that's really, really important and needs to be taught and coached.
Because usually those, I think what you're trying to demonstrate, if you make those investments, it pays dividends in terms of clarity of accountability, role clarity, things like that. So perfect. We'll see if there's any other questions. I do have a question, and I can't remember if I got to some of it yesterday with you, but what I often find is you do these plans, you can identify if you do an integrated plan, like attributing resources to it, but when you actually come to sort of a senior leader and say there's not enough resources to do the work that is on our plan, well, what are the trade-offs, what can we postpone? It's a really tough battle to try and really say we can't keep doing more with less, we have to, this is what we have. So just wondering so those input measures I think are critical, but sometimes I don't know if they're always reflected upon the way they need to be. So just wondering what you
no, that and I think you're exactly right. And one of the hardest parts, I talk about the hard part of being a manager, is figuring out to get this balance right. Just to complete your thought on that, Jennifer, which I think was really good on doing your job well, is that's when the magic happens with the team, because then that's when the synergy kicks in with the team, that they can accomplish those things you couldn't have anticipated accomplishing on your own. So it is worth the effort. When it comes to setting priorities, that's the other hard part of a manager, director, vice president, head of organization job. It's really easy to keep loading things on. This is a priority. We've got to get this done. We've got to get this done without thinking about what are the resource implications and the load that you're placing on your people. So part of the job as the manager isn't to delegate without thought to those things. It really is to help set the priorities, because if the manager or the executive doesn't set the priorities, then the person will be forced to not do something because they just simply won't have the resources to do it. And that is absolutely contrary to achieving a good strategy, because you don't know what it is they're not going to be able to get to do. So it's much better to put the energy up front to help people focus in on that work that you know is important. And if you can't do it all, then that's part of your job as an executive to figure out what it is that we will focus on.
Yeah, how to focus in on priorities. I have one last question, and then we can maybe, Dwight, you can give a bit of an overview of tomorrow's session. That's the big culmination.
Mm-hmm.
I thought I had here, when observe, this is a tough question again from Milos, which doesn't surprise me. When observing the outcomes, how do you know how much to tweak the inputs as to get back on track and attaining the targeted level of outcomes? Is there any science to it? In my answer would probably be no, but maybe there is. I mean,
well, if you do have input measures, then you can build longitudinal information about how well your managers overall are managing in terms of the feedback you get from their teams, and with specific managers as well. So if you can automate through SurveyMonkey or whatever other tool those key measures in terms of what you think is important, and get those measures, you can see whether people are improving or not. But it's also partly in terms of that coaching. So one of the things I do recommend is, while a manager must never delegate directly to the subordinates of their subordinates, in other words, you don't skip delegate, you should be talking to them, and you should have a sense of them about how well their managers are doing, because that's your future team members are one level removed from you. So it is keeping your eyes and ears open, talking to people, but you can get formal measures which can see how well you're improving or not as an organization, and how well or not each manager is improving.
perfect.
Excellent. So tomorrow is the panel discussion. I'm very pleased. John Burke is here. He's one of our panelists. He's the head of the Business Excellence Institute out of Ireland. So he's going to give us his perceptions. We also have Murray Cronick, who's with BDO here in Ottawa. He's going to give us some of his insights. And Sandy Moir, who has her own consulting practice also here in Ottawa, and she's going to give her insights. So we're going to start off. I'll give a quick summary of what we've talked about in these 2 days for those who are fresh to the panel. But then I've got a series of questions and discussion points to get their perceptions on what input measures are, how important they are, and some of these things that they have seen in their consulting and other practice around those. But most of the day is intended to be answering your questions. So we also would like you to give us your viewpoints and to suggest changes suggest how all of us might adapt best practices by learning from each other. And then finally, just to let you know, the session 1 will be available on the YouTube channel very quickly. It is there. It's going to go into the chat right now, so it's already there. And please do feel free to share that with any colleagues that you think might get some benefit from it.
Perfect. Thanks. We'll see you back here tomorrow.
Thank you all. See you tomorrow.
Thanks everyone for joining in.